The receipt paper felt softer than it should have. Maybe it was because my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Rain tapped against the diner's front windows, blurring the glow of the streetlights outside. Inside, the dinner rush had ended hours ago, leaving only the quiet clink of silverware and the low murmur coming from the private dining room. That room wasn't for people like me. I was only allowed inside long enough to refill coffee, clear plates, and disappear before anyone remembered my face. But that night, disappearing became impossible. The coffee in my left hand had already gone lukewarm by the time I pushed open the heavy oak door. Every conversation stopped. Not because of me. Because he was sitting at the head of the table. Matteo Romano. Even before I knew his name, I knew the silence that followed him. 3 men in dark suits stood near the walls without speaking. Nobody checked a phone. Nobody interrupted. Even the expensive watches resting beside crystal water glasses seemed to tick more quietly around him. He didn't look at me. He was studying a thick folder while another man explained figures tied to cargo shipments arriving through the port before sunrise. Numbers. Rows of them. Something about them snagged my attention before I could stop myself. I poured coffee into Matteo's cup first, then moved clockwise around the table the way we'd been trained. My eyes drifted toward the paperwork for only a heartbeat. One invoice number. Then another. My pulse stumbled. That couldn't be right. The same cargo reference appeared on 2 different delivery summaries. I blinked, convinced I had imagined it. When I returned to the service station, I found the catering receipt clipped beneath our order ticket. Without thinking, I copied the number onto the blank back. 48173, I checked it once. Twice. 3 times. The digits refused to change. My manager called my name from the kitchen, but I barely heard him. Every sensible thought told me to throw the receipt away. I was a waitress working a double shift, not an accountant, not an investigator. Powerful men didn't appreciate interruptions from women carrying coffee pots. Still. I walked back into the private room. My heart hammered so loudly I was certain someone would hear it. As I lifted Matteo's empty cup, I slid the folded receipt beneath the saucer. Our eyes met for the first time. I might be wrong, I whispered, careful that no one else could hear. If I am, just throw it away. He unfolded the receipt. His gaze settled on the handwritten number. For one impossible second, every sound inside the room disappeared. Then Matteo quietly closed the leather folder in front of him. The meeting is over. No explanation. No raised voice. Just 6 words. Chairs scraped the floor. The men around the table stared at him in disbelief. Across from him, one executive suddenly lost every trace of color in his face. And all I could think was, God, what had I just done? If you'd like, I can continue with part 2 only, preserving this voice, pacing, and continuity. I barely slept. Every time headlights swept across the ceiling of my apartment, I sat upright, convinced black SUVs had finally found my building. By 6:30 the next morning, I gave up pretending I could rest. I buttoned the same faded diner uniform I'd worn the night before, tucked my name tag into place, and checked the hallway through the peephole before opening the door. No one. Just peeling paint, an empty stairwell, and the smell of someone burning toast downstairs. I almost laughed at myself. Almost. When I stepped outside, a black SUV was parked across the street. It wasn't blocking my way. No one got out. The windows were too dark to see inside. I lowered my head and hurried toward the bus stop without looking back. Halfway there, my cell phone buzzed. An unknown number. I let it ring until voicemail picked up. A minute later it rang again. Then again. 3 calls. No message. My stomach tightened harder with every vibration. People like Matteo Romano didn't need to threaten someone twice. If I'd embarrassed him in front of those executives, maybe this was simply how powerful men collected apologies. By the time the bus reached downtown, I'd already imagined losing my job a dozen different ways. The diner couldn't afford bad publicity. Neither could I. Friday's tips were supposed to cover Dad's blood pressure prescription. Rent was due in 4 days. My old Honda still sat in the mechanic's lot because replacing the water pump cost more than I had managed to save in 3 months. Missing even 1 week's pay meant deciding which bill could wait and which one couldn't. There was never enough money for everything. Only enough for whichever problem yelled the loudest. Dad was already awake when I stopped by the apartment after my morning split shift. He sat beside the window with reading glasses balanced halfway down his nose, studying classified ads he no longer needed. Old habits survived even when careers didn't. "You look tired," he said. "I just worked late." He smiled without believing me. He had spent 30 years balancing company books before one investigation erased everything he'd built. No criminal charges. No public apology either. Just quiet whispers, a lost pension, and employers who suddenly stopped returning his calls. He had always told me numbers mattered because they couldn't flatter anyone. If they didn't add up, neither did the story. Maybe that was why my eyes kept finding mistakes other people ignored. I never told him about the receipt. I couldn't bear watching another worry settle behind his eyes. When I returned to the diner that afternoon, my manager was waiting beside the register. "You know somebody came asking for you?" The room suddenly felt too warm. "What did they want?" "They didn't say." "What did they look like?" "Expensive." He shrugged. "Nice suits." "Polite." One of them asked if Claire Dawson was working today. Every muscle in my body tightened. Did you tell them?" "I said you weren't here yet." He studied me for a moment. "You in some kind of trouble?" "I don't think so." But the words sounded hollow even to me. The lunch crowd drifted in, filling booths with the smell of bacon, fresh coffee, and grilled onions. I tried pouring refills without spilling a drop, but my hands weren't as steady as yesterday. Every time the front door opened, I looked up. Every dark suit made my pulse race. Then, just before the dinner rush began, the hostess walked toward me carrying a cream-colored business card between 2 fingers. "Claire," she whispered, her expression strangely pale. "They're back. And, they said Mr. Romano would like to speak with you." The cream-colored card felt heavier than paper. It carried no logo. No phone number. Only one name pressed into the thick stock with black lettering. Matteo Romano. Underneath, in smaller print, asterisk, "Please come as my guest." Asterisk, not an order. Not exactly an invitation either. My manager looked far more nervous than I was. "You don't have to go," he muttered, although we both knew refusing someone like Matteo Romano wasn't as simple as declining dinner plans. "I'll be back before my shift starts," I said, hoping I sounded more confident than I felt. Outside, the same black SUV waited along the curb. One man stepped forward before I reached it. Gray suit. Earpiece. Perfectly polished shoes. He opened the rear door without touching my arm. "Miss Dawson." His voice stayed respectful. "Mr. Romano appreciates your time." Appreciates. That wasn't the word I'd expected. The ride lasted less than 15 minutes. Nobody spoke. Rain streaked across the tinted windows while warehouses gave way to brick buildings carrying the Romano family name above loading docks and distribution centers. Delivery trucks rolled quietly through secured gates. Forklifts moved pallets with practiced precision. Men nodded to one another instead of shouting. Nothing looked theatrical. Nothing needed to. Power didn't announce itself. It simply expected the world to keep moving around it. The SUV stopped beside an old brick headquarters overlooking the river. Inside, polished wood replaced polished marble. Family photographs lined the hallway beside framed newspaper clippings celebrating food drives, scholarship donations, and neighborhood festivals that stretched back decades. For a strange moment, it felt less like entering an empire and more like stepping into someone's family history. I was shown into a conference room. Mateo stood alone beside the windows, looking toward the loading docks below. He turned as I entered. You came. I wasn't sure saying no was an option. The corner of his mouth almost moved. It always is. He gestured toward a chair. No guards crowded behind me. No threats. No raised voices. That unsettled me more than anger would have. He placed my receipt on the table between us. The paper had been flattened carefully, every crease preserved. You said you might be wrong. I did. Were you? I don't know. He nodded once. Tell me why you wrote this number. I stared at the receipt. Because I saw it twice. His expression didn't change. Where? One copy was attached to our catering paperwork. I hesitated, replaying the moment in my head. The other was on one of the shipment summaries lying open during your meeting. I looked up. The numbers were identical. They shouldn't have been. No. The answer came before I could think. Catering invoices and cargo references don't share numbering systems. They're generated separately. The room fell quiet. Only then did I realize how naturally those words had come out. I hadn't spoken like a waitress. I'd spoken the way Dad used to when he spread ledgers across our tiny kitchen table and challenged me to find the mistake before dinner was ready. Mateo noticed. You've studied accounting. It wasn't a question. 2 years at community college. I looked down at my hands. I left before finishing. Why? My father needed me more than school did. He didn't offer sympathy. He simply accepted the answer. A soft knock interrupted us. The conference room door opened. A sharply dressed man carrying several thick folders walked in without looking at me. Then he stopped. His eyes landed on the receipt. For only a heartbeat. But it was enough. Something behind his calm expression tightened so quickly it almost disappeared. Almost. He smiled at Mateo. I didn't realize we were inviting restaurant staff into financial meetings. For the first time since leaving the diner, I had the unmistakable feeling that someone in this building wanted that little receipt to disappear. The room became very quiet. Not the comfortable kind of silence that settles over people working. This silence measured everyone. The man with the folders placed them neatly on the polished table before finally looking at me again. His smile never reached his eyes. I'm Victor Kane, he said. Chief Financial Officer. He spoke as though the title should explain everything. It seems we've interrupted your shift. I folded my hands together to keep them from trembling. I can go if I'm not needed. Victor gave a soft laugh. I believe that's the first thing we've agreed on. No one else laughed. Mateo hadn't moved. He remained standing beside the window, one hand resting lightly on the back of his chair, watching us with an expression too calm to read. Victor opened one folder. There are over 8,000 invoices processed through Romano Distribution every month. He flipped several pages toward me. Accounting systems are complicated. Similar numbers happen. That's why professionals handle them. He emphasized the last word without raising his voice. I felt my cheeks grow warm. Maybe he was right. Maybe I'd embarrassed everyone over a coincidence. The sensible thing would have been to apologize. To return to the diner. To pretend none of this had happened. Instead, I looked down at the copied number on my receipt one more time. Dad's voice echoed somewhere in the back of my mind. Asterisk numbers don't get offended. People do. Asterisk, if I'm mistaken, I said quietly, I'll apologize. Victor leaned back. There won't be any need. But if I'm right. He interrupted before I could finish. Miss Dawson. His tone stayed pleasant. How much accounting experience does a diner waitress have? The words landed exactly as he'd intended. Not cruel enough to sound cruel. Just dismissive enough to make everyone else question whether I belonged in the room. I swallowed. Not enough to replace your job. A few people exchanged surprised glances. But enough to know two independent numbering systems shouldn't produce identical reference codes. Victor's smile faded almost imperceptibly. Shouldn't? No. He slid one invoice toward me. Then explain it. Every eye in the room settled on me. My pulse pounded so hard it almost drowned out the air conditioner humming overhead. I forced myself to breathe. I didn't reach for the folder immediately. Instead, I looked at the page the way Dad had taught me years ago. Not searching for mistakes. Searching for patterns. The invoice number ended in 3 digits. The shipment code followed an entirely different format. Except. I looked at my receipt again. Then back to the invoice. The sequence isn't identical, I said. Victor smiled again. I thought so. It's worse. His smile stopped. The first 4 digits match because they're generated by the regional warehouse. I pointed farther down the page. But these last 5. My fingertip rested beside the printed code. Identify individual cargo releases. I slowly turned my receipt over. The same release can't legally belong to 2 different shipments processed on different dates. No one spoke. Victor answered first. It can if paperwork is corrected. Before delivery. Or after. Not after. The words came out stronger than I'd intended. If it's changed afterward, every connected record has to change too. I looked around the room. I only saw one copy. Mateo finally spoke. Why does that matter? I met his eyes. Because if someone changed one document. I hesitated. They forgot another. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. Victor closed the folder a little too quickly. So your theory is that my department has somehow fabricated financial records because a waitress noticed a number over a cup of coffee? I didn't say fabricated. What are you saying? I took one slow breath. I'm saying I noticed something that deserves another look. Nothing more. Nothing less. For the first time since I'd entered the building, Mateo looked away from the paperwork and studied me instead. Not my uniform. Not my nervous hands. My eyes. As if he were measuring whether fear was making me reckless. Or whether honesty was making me brave. Finally, he spoke without taking his gaze off me. How many times did you check that number before you handed me the receipt? My fingers tightened around the edge of the paper. 3. Why 3? Because the first time I hoped I was wrong. The room stayed silent. Mateo gave one slow nod. Then he turned toward Victor. Bring me every catering invoice connected to that warehouse for the last 6 months. Victor's expression remained controlled. Only his hand betrayed him. For the briefest instant, his thumb pressed hard enough against the folder to bend the cardboard cover. And I realized he wasn't afraid of me. He was afraid of what those invoices might still be hiding. Boxes of invoices arrived on rolling carts. I had never seen so much paper in one room. 2 assistants stacked thick binders across the conference table until they formed a wall between Victor and me. Fresh coffee filled the air, but no one reached for a cup. The only sounds were pages turning and the quiet hum of the air conditioner. Victor adjusted his cuff links with the calm confidence of a man who believed the numbers belonged to him. They're welcome to search, he said. It will waste everyone's afternoon, but perhaps that's the price of entertaining imagination. I looked at Mateo. If I'm wasting your time, tell me now. He pulled out a chair. Show me what you saw. Nothing more. No encouragement. No warning. Just an opportunity. I sat carefully, smoothing the first stack of invoices in front of me. My fingertips brushed familiar columns, dates, warehouse codes, delivery routes, signatures. They looked intimidating to everyone else. To me, they looked like puzzles. Dad used to scatter grocery receipts across our kitchen table on Sunday nights and ask me to find the one total that didn't belong. He said mistakes rarely hit alone. They left tiny footprints behind them. I wasn't searching for one number anymore. I was searching for footprints. I opened 3 folders side by side. The catering invoices all begin with the restaurant district code, I said quietly. Then the order date. Victor folded his arms. Correct. But the cargo releases don't. I lifted another page. They're assigned only after shipments are approved. He shrugged. That's standard procedure. Then why? I slid 2 documents closer together. Do these approvals happen 6 days apart but carry the same release sequence? A man near the end of the table leaned forward. Victor answered before anyone else could speak. Data migration. I nodded slowly. That would explain matching warehouse numbers. I tapped the page. It wouldn't explain matching release numbers. The room grew still again. One assistant walked closer. So those shouldn't repeat. They can. Victor answered first. I shook my head. Not like this. I pointed at the dates. If one shipment leaves on Tuesday and another leaves almost a week later, each release should receive its own authorization. I turned another page. Instead, I placed a 3rd invoice beside the first 2. This sequence appears again. No one interrupted me now. I wasn't talking quickly anymore. I wasn't defending myself. I was simply following the trail the numbers kept leaving behind. Victor smiled again, though it looked tighter than before. Miss Dawson, you found 3 matching codes out of thousands. I've found 3 in 20 minutes. His smile disappeared. A gray-haired operations manager slowly removed his reading glasses. Victor. He frowned at the paperwork. I've never noticed duplicate releases before. Victor answered without hesitation. Because they're corrected electronically after reconciliation. I looked up. Then why are these printed originals still different? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for the folders. I'll have accounting verify them. My hand moved before I thought about it. I rested my fingers lightly on the top document. Please don't separate them. Victor looked at my hand as if I'd crossed a line. They need to stay together. Why? Because individually they look ordinary. I swallowed. Together they tell a story. For the first time, several people around the table began moving their own stacks into matching groups instead of waiting for instructions. Paper slid across polished wood. Someone circled repeated codes with a pencil. Another employee quietly whispered, "Here's another one." Then another voice answered from farther down the table. I found one too. The room no longer belonged to Victor. It belonged to the evidence. I felt Mateo's eyes on me before he spoke. You didn't memorize those formats. No. Then how? I looked down at the receipt still lying beside the folders. When you spend years wondering whether your father was blamed for numbers that never made sense. My voice softened. You stop reading invoices one line at a time. I looked back at him. You start listening to what they're trying not to say. Nobody laughed. Nobody called me a waitress. Even Victor stayed silent. Then the conference room door opened. A young employee hurried inside carrying another archive box, breathing hard. I'm sorry, he said. We almost couldn't find these. Victor turned so quickly his chair scraped across the floor. What archive? The off-site storage records. The color drained from Victor's face for the second time since I'd met him. And something inside me whispered that whatever he had hoped would stay buried had just been brought back into the room. The room seemed smaller after the archive box arrived. Dust clung to its cardboard edges as the young employee set it beside the newer files. Someone peeled away the faded packing tape, releasing the dry smell of old paper that had spent years in storage. Victor spoke before anyone touched it. Those records were archived because they're obsolete. His voice remained even. Too even. Mateo didn't look at him. Open it. No one argued. The employee lifted out worn folders tied with faded string. Unlike the polished binders already spread across the table, these pages carried handwritten initials, coffee stains, and yellowed corners. Real working documents. The kind no one expected strangers to read years later. I felt every eye drift toward me again. Not because I belonged there. Because I had started something no one else could ignore. I reached for the oldest folder carefully. I don't know what we'll find. Mateo gave a short nod. Neither do I. It was the first time he'd admitted uncertainty. For some reason, that steadied me. I untied the string and spread several pages across the table beside the newer invoices. My fingers automatically lined up the columns, matching warehouse codes first, dates second, release numbers last. The habit came so naturally I barely noticed I was doing it. Dad always said numbers became easier to understand once they could see each other. I compared the old release log with the duplicate invoice we'd already identified. Then another. My heartbeat slowed instead of racing. The pattern was becoming clearer. They changed the format, I murmured. Victor folded his arms. Every company updates paperwork. Yes. I traced one column with my fingertip. But they didn't change the sequence. Several heads lifted. I slid the old log beside the newer invoice. The release numbers continued forward exactly as they should. I moved another page into place. Except for these. For documents now lay in a neat row. Every surrounding sequence advanced normally. Only one repeated. Like a skipped heartbeat. The operations manager leaned closer. That's impossible. Victor answered immediately. No, it's a filing error. I looked up. If it were filing. I tapped the surrounding records. The mistake would move with the paperwork. My finger rested on the repeated number. It didn't. It stayed. Silence settled across the room. Someone quietly turned another page. Another employee found the same interruption farther down the archive. No one spoke this time. They simply brought the document to the table. Victor's jaw tightened almost invisibly. There are thousands of records. There are, I agreed. And almost everyone behaves exactly the way it should. I looked at Mateo. That's why these stand out. He walked closer for the first time since I'd arrived. Not toward the invoices. Toward me. He studied the papers for several long seconds before speaking. If she's wrong. His calm voice filled the room. Every contract connected to this warehouse is delayed. The words landed like stone. Millions of dollars. Hundreds of employees. Entire delivery schedules. All resting on whether I had mistaken a pattern for proof. The weight settled across my shoulders so suddenly I could hardly breathe. Victor finally smiled again. There. He spread one hand across the table. Now we understand the cost of entertaining theories. I stared at the receipt still lying beside my notebook. For the first time since this began, doubt crept into my chest. What if I really had seen only coincidence? What if every truck waiting outside these warehouses stopped because I couldn't let one number go? Mateo must have noticed the change in my face. He spoke quietly enough that only I heard him. You don't need certainty. I looked at him. You need honesty. He turned back toward the room. No contracts move. Victor blinked. Until when? Until every repeated release number has been verified. No anger. No threats. Just an order no one questioned. Then Mateo looked toward the head of security. Miss Dawson goes home with an escort tonight. I opened my mouth. That's not necessary. It isn't a reward, he said. It is a precaution. Victor gave a small, almost invisible shake of his head. The gesture lasted less than a second. But it wasn't directed at Mateo. It was aimed at someone standing just outside the conference room door. And whoever received that silent signal disappeared down the hallway before I could see their face. Victor didn't chase the man who had slipped out of the conference room. He didn't have to. By the time the door clicked shut, his expression had already settled back into the calm confidence he'd worn since I arrived. "If we're delaying millions of dollars in contracts," he said, smoothing the front of his jacket, "I'd like the decision to rest on facts instead of coincidence." No one argued with that. Not even me. I wanted facts more than anyone in the room. The trouble was, the facts were scattered across hundreds of pages, hiding inside ordinary numbers that most people would never read twice. The operations manager slowly pushed another stack of invoices toward me. "Take your time." I nodded. For a few moments, the only sound was paper sliding against polished wood. My pulse steadied as I compared dates, warehouse codes, release numbers, and approval signatures. I stopped trying to prove myself right. I simply looked for consistency. That was when I saw it. Not a new number. The same one. 48173, it appeared exactly where I'd expected, and exactly where it shouldn't. I traced the surrounding entries with my finger. The sequence before it moved forward naturally. The sequence after it moved forward naturally. Only that release number refused to belong. I looked at the matching archive sheet beside it. Then at the newer invoice. Then back again. The room seemed to disappear around me. "Mr. Romano." My voice came out quieter than I intended. "I think we've been asking the wrong question." Victor folded his arms. "And what question should we be asking? Not whether this number repeats." I slid the 2 pages together until their edges lined up perfectly. "We should ask why everything around it keeps changing." I tapped the repeated entry. "While this one never does." Several people leaned forward at once. The gray-haired operations manager adjusted his glasses. "I don't follow." I took a slow breath. If this were a simple clerical mistake, the repeated number would move when the paperwork changed. I pointed to the approval dates. The dates changed. Another column. The shipment descriptions changed. Another. The invoice formatting changed. Finally, I rested my finger on the familiar 5 digits. But this didn't. Silence. Victor answered almost immediately. Or someone copied an old template. I nodded. That would explain one document. I gathered the others into a neat row. It doesn't explain all of them. He walked around the table until he stood only a few feet away from me. For the first time, I could smell the sharp scent of his expensive cologne. "Miss Dawson." His voice remained pleasant. "Have you ever managed a shipping network?" "No." "An accounting department?" "No." "A logistics company employing hundreds of people?" "No." He spread one hand. "Then perhaps you're confusing unfamiliar procedures with fraud." The word hung in the air. Fraud. I hadn't said it. He had. I looked up slowly. "I've never accused anyone." His jaw tightened. "I've only said these records deserve another look." "You've implied quite a bit more." "I don't need to imply anything." I gently turned the receipt over, laying it beside the invoices once again. The numbers already speak. Nobody interrupted. The room had changed. Earlier, they had watched me because I was out of place. Now they watched the paperwork. The evidence had become more interesting than the waitress holding it. Matteo hadn't spoken in several minutes. He stood with both hands resting lightly on the back of his chair, studying every face in the room instead of every page. When he finally broke the silence, it wasn't to me. "Victor." "Yes?" "When was the last time these archived records were independently reviewed?" Victor answered without hesitation. "They weren't required to be." "That wasn't my question." A pause. "Several years." Matteo gave one slow nod. "No one leaves." The sentence was calm. Absolute. No one reached for a phone. No one stood. Outside the conference room windows, forklifts continued moving pallets across the loading yard as though nothing had changed. Inside, every heartbeat seemed louder. The operations manager suddenly stopped turning pages. He stared at one document so intensely that his glasses slipped down his nose. Mr. Romano. He swallowed. I think Claire needs to see this. He slid a single invoice across the table toward me. I looked down. My breath caught. The approval date matched one of the duplicated releases. So did the warehouse. So did the formatting. Only one space on the page was different. The authorization signature. It wasn't missing. It had been replaced. Without lifting my eyes from the paper, I whispered, if this signature doesn't match the others. The room fell into complete silence. Because everyone understood what had to happen next. I kept my eyes on the signature. Not because I recognized the name. Because I recognized the hesitation. Every other authorization in the stack had been signed with the same confident stroke, the same pressure, the same slant. This one looked as though someone had practiced it instead of owning it. I slid the page beside the archive copy. Look here. The operations manager leaned over first. Then another supervisor. No one touched the papers. They only followed where my finger rested. The release number stayed the same, I said quietly. The warehouse stayed the same. The sequence stayed the same. But the authorization changed. Victor answered before anyone else. Managers change. Signatures change. They do. I nodded. But release authorizations don't move backward. I pulled the older archive page beside the newer invoice. The archive shows this shipment was already cleared. My finger moved to the second document. So why would someone authorize the same release again weeks later? No one spoke. I looked at Matteo. The only reason to reuse the same release is if someone wanted another shipment to inherit the first shipment's history. The gray-haired operations manager slowly removed his glasses. That would hide it inside an approved record. I nodded once. Exactly. Victor laughed, but the sound landed flat. This is speculation. It was. I reached for the final folder that had been lying unopened beside the others since the archive box arrived. I thought it was. I opened it carefully. Inside was the reconciliation summary that matched the shipment sequence we'd been following all afternoon. Nothing dramatic. No confession. No shocking note. Just columns. Dates. Release numbers. Approvals. Payments. The same quiet language numbers had always spoken. I traced the repeated entry. Then the payment reference beneath it. Then the corresponding invoice. It isn't one duplicate. I looked around the room. It's one release used to move multiple payments. The operations manager compared the pages himself. His brow tightened. He checked them again. Then a third time. When he finally looked up, he wasn't looking at me. He was looking at Victor. These totals shouldn't balance. Victor took a step forward. They do. They balance because the same authorization was recycled. The older man turned another page. And every correction points back to your department. Silence settled over the conference room. Not uncertainty anymore. Recognition. One supervisor quietly gathered the matching invoices into a single stack. Another highlighted every repeated release number we'd found. No one waited for my instructions. The evidence had become undeniable. Victor's confidence finally cracked. This proves nothing. It proves enough. Matteo's voice was calm. No louder than before. Yet every person in the room turned toward him. He walked to the head of the table and rested one hand on the folders. I asked whether one waitress had interrupted an important meeting. His eyes never left Victor. Instead, she interrupted a lie. Victor opened his mouth. Matteo raised one finger. No. The room fell silent again. You had every opportunity to explain the discrepancies. Victor's shoulders stiffened. They're accounting irregularities. They're deliberate. The operations manager slowly pushed the completed stack toward Matteo. I agree. Another supervisor spoke next. So do I. A third nodded without saying a word. Matteo closed the folders. Victor Kane. His voice remained measured. As of this moment, you're relieved of every financial responsibility within Romano Distribution. No one protested. 2 security officers stepped inside after a quiet nod from the head of security. They didn't grab Victor. They simply stood beside him. Professional. Respectful. Final. Matteo looked toward the operations manager. Preserve every original document. Then to company counsel. Notify the auditors. Finally, his attention returned to me. Prepare a complete review of every transaction connected to these release numbers. He wasn't giving the order to me. He was giving it because of me. The difference mattered. I stared at the little diner receipt still resting beside the folders. The paper had softened from being unfolded so many times. A few hours earlier it had looked disposable. Now it had stopped a multi-million-dollar negotiation, exposed years of deception, and forced an entire room of powerful people to admit that the waitress they had dismissed was the first person who had listened carefully enough to hear the truth hidden inside ordinary numbers. For the first time in years, I thought about my father. Not as the man whose career had been quietly destroyed, but as the man who had taught me that numbers never needed courage. People did. And before anyone left that room, Matteo gave one final instruction. Find every case touched by these records. If an innocent name was buried with this fraud. He looked at me only briefly. We're going to give it back. 3 weeks later, the diner smelled exactly the way it always had. Fresh coffee. Butter on the grill. Maple syrup warming beneath the breakfast lights. For the first time in a long while, those ordinary things felt extraordinary. I tied my apron without checking the front window for black SUVs. I smiled at regular customers because I wanted to, not because I was afraid of losing tips. Some things hadn't changed. My feet still ached after double shifts. The coffee machine still hissed louder than necessary. The lunch crowd still arrived 5 minutes before everyone else. But the weight I'd carried for years was gone. Dad noticed it before I did. The official letter sat folded on our kitchen table beside his reading glasses. After a complete review of the records, the company had formally cleared his name. His personnel file had been corrected. The accusations that had quietly followed him for years no longer stood. He read the letter twice before looking at me. I told you numbers mattered. I laughed through tears. You told me people did. He smiled. They matter even more. Late that afternoon, the bell above the diner's front door chimed. I looked up from refilling sugar dispensers. Matteo Romano walked in alone. No meeting. No convoy filling the parking lot. No announcement. Just a man who quietly chose a booth near the window. I carried a fresh cup of coffee to his table. This time my hands didn't shake. He noticed. So, he said, you checked the coffee only once? I smiled. I've become more confident. I can see that. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence felt warm instead of heavy. He reached into his coat and placed a sealed envelope on the table. I asked Human Resources to contact you. I looked at the envelope but didn't touch it. An interview, he said. With the accounting department of the legitimate company. Nothing more. And if I say no? His answer came without hesitation. Then you keep serving coffee. I looked at him. No disappointment? A faint smile crossed his face. I respected your judgment before you ever worked for me. He stood to leave. Halfway to the door, he stopped. You reminded a room full of powerful men that truth doesn't become smaller because it comes from someone wearing an apron. Then he walked out into the afternoon sunlight. I didn't chase after him. I didn't open the envelope right away, either. Some opportunities are more meaningful when they're chosen freely. I slipped it into my apron pocket beside a blank receipt. The same kind of paper that everyone else thought was disposable. Funny how a single receipt had changed so many lives. Not because it carried the right number. Because, for once, someone powerful believed the woman who wrote it.